I call the honourable member Scott Simpson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. It's a pleasure to stand and rise and take a brief call in support of this Prisoners and Victims Claim Continuation and Reform Amendment Bill in its second reading. And at the outset, Mr Speaker, I'd like to acknowledge the support from the previous Speaker on behalf of the Labour Party, who are going to support this good piece of legislation. Because, of course, the purpose of this bill is to make the restrictions on awards of compensation and the victims' claims process in the Principal Act of 2005 permanent. And as Andrew Little said, it is, and I'm sure he didn't mean to make a pun, but it is a confined solution to a confined problem. And it's a good solution. Mr Little talked a little about the... I didn't mean that. I didn't mean that, actually. It's early in the morning. But Mr Little did say in his presentation that the review, or a review, should have taken place. Well, of course, there's not much need for a review when a system and a piece of legislation is working very well. And the government, I'm very pleased to say, is satisfied that this scheme is working well. The scheme represents our commitment to victims and the focus upon victims who are, of course, participants in our criminal justice system completely as a result of other people's actions and not their own. So this is a government that I'm part of, and we're committed to ensuring that victims are supported, and the scheme that we're supporting today achieves that endeavour. And so we make no apology, Mr Speaker, at all for focusing our justice system on the rights of victims. It's a right and appropriate that we should do that. Mr Speaker, as Chairman of the Justice and Electoral Select Committee, I was very pleased with the way the committee worked through our deliberations on this bill. The committee received 7 submissions and recommended that the bill proceed without amendment. I speak in support of the bill. It's a good bill. I commend it to the House.
Great speech, Scotty. Mr Speaker.
I call the Honourable Philip Goff.
Mr Speaker, there was an unfortunate complacency, I think, in Mr Simpson's speech there when he said that the scheme was working well and it's looking after victims. I beg to differ, and I beg to differ from the perspective of one who introduced this legislation in the first place and had it legislated through Parliament. The reason that I put a sunset clause in the legislation back in 2005 was because I wanted to review the scheme to see that it was doing much more than just a stopgap measure against windfall profits arising out of the Tonoa case. I wanted to be sure that victims were properly compensated by those who offended against them horrendously when the criminal offender was in a position to provide that compensation. As it works out, the legislation probably had a prohibitive effect in terms of some gold mining lawyers on behalf of some really hardcore criminals, but it hasn't raised a lot of money for victims. I think it was about 45,000 from memory. And there seemed to me to be a lot of people, not just the vicious blue-collar criminals that were never compensating their victims, but another whole category of criminals. And these, Mr Simpson, are the people that the National Party know better. The rich and the powerful, the reckless and the greedy. They are the white-collar criminals. Tohunare knows exactly who I'm talking about. These are the white-collar criminals that rip off people's life savings. I've got, the member will have, as I have in my electorate, people who have lost their entire life savings because of the greed and the recklessness and the criminality of people that went to King's College, that have big houses on Paratai Drive, that have all the privileges in life, but they're criminals nevertheless. And I say that when those rich and powerful and privileged criminals rip off the people and their life savings, you can't just put them in jail for 2 years, allow them to protect their savings in family trusts, come out and get on with their high-style lifestyles while their victims go to their graves penniless because they rip them off. And I say, Mr Speaker, absolutely nothing in this legislation addresses that class of criminal. Absolutely nothing. And yet we have seen in the last 5 years, time and again, people like Petrovich or whatever his name is, that ripped off people in the 80s and ripped them off again in the 21st century, out of jail after a while and living the high lifestyle, but they stole not bits and pieces out of houses like burglars do, they stole hundreds of millions of dollars. They didn't steal because they were underprivileged, they stole because they were greedy. And yet they get away with a situation where they never pay their dues, Minister, they never pay their dues to society. And the reason that I put a sunset clause in this legislation was not simply to stop people getting windfall gains who are rotten criminals who never gave any compensation to their victims. That's why I did it in the first instance. But I put the review clause in to ensure, look, I hope the Minister will take a call to explain herself and justify herself, because the review clause was there, the sunset clause was there, so there would be a review, so that you, Minister, could use your imagination, show some determination.
I'm sorry to interrupt the honourable member. There is interjections taking place between members who don't have the call, and that is out of order. I know Mr Goff's making a strong, robust speech, but that doesn't mean that members from that side and that side can interject on each other. If you want to interject on Mr Goff, that's fine, but not on each other. I call the Honourable Phil Goff.
Mr Speaker, it's really sad over these debates where time and again the government side failed to take the call, don't show the intestinal fortitude, I think that's a word for guts, to get up and debate the bill, but will sit in their seat and interject continuously. And what I'm saying to the Minister that was interjecting is that the sunset clause was for a review so that we could see how we could get this legislation working better for victims. The legislation has expired a number of times. Did the government ever use the opportunity to be imaginative, to show their commitment and their determination to support the rights of victims by getting a piece of legislation that dealt not with a tiny minority of cases in prison, cases where the Corrections Department got it wrong and were forced to pay compensation, but the wider spectrum of criminal offenders who never set things right for their victims? I'm a strong believer in restorative justice. What restorative justice means is that the offender sets things right for the victims. My colleague next to me knows the system of e whanga in Samoa, which is based on a person showing remorse and trying to put things right for the victim. Now, yeah, Mr Lotu Ingoa will know that system. He should know about it. And, you know, in terms of restorative justice, it's really important that the offender shows remorse, genuine remorse. But that's not very concrete. What is concrete is if the offender is able to make a reparation payment. And too often, with our offenders, they come from dysfunctional backgrounds, they have no savings, they have no income. When they're locked up in prison, they have no ability to pay. And in most cases, victims get nothing back from their offenders. Now, that's a fact of life. You can't get blood out of a stone. What you can do, if there's a windfall profit by an offender, such as through the compensation cases that followed Taunoa, is that they have got money and you can get it and you can give it to the victim. Or if somebody wins lotto in prison, you know, if they're sitting on $1 million and they have done grievous damage to their victims, then they should be required to make a payment when they're able to. That's common sense. That's justice in the real meaning of the word. But why I focused before on the white-collar offender was that after the global financial crisis, which revealed the recklessness and the greed of those white-collar offenders, and a number of them have ended up in prison, they are the very people that could be required to make compensation. Maybe not at the time they're in prison, but thereafter. There are people that were imprisoned from the 80s that are now very wealthy businessmen again. Have they ever done anything to set things right for their victims? And the answer is no. They're back sipping their cocktails, living in their mansions, driving their flash cars, when they have driven other people into poverty at the end of their life. And I resent that. I deeply resent that. I resent it because I've represented constituents who have been placed in that situation, worked hard all their life to get their savings, maybe somewhat naively putting their money in particular institutions that weren't sufficiently blue chip. But they did it in good faith. They believed the promises that were made. They had their savings ripped off, and the people that did it to them never pay their dues. And while we will support this legislation, reluctantly, because those that get windfall profits in one way, no, Mr. Simpson, you should have listened. And that's one of your problems as a new member. You haven't learned to listen yet. What the government could have done is not simply raise $45,000 for victims. They could have raised tens of millions of dollars to be paid back to victims if they had been imaginative in the sort of legislation they put through to get those white-collar criminals who ripped off their fellow citizens to have to pay their dues, to have to indulge in restorative justice to set things right for those who have suffered. So my objection to this legislation is that it doesn't go anywhere far enough. It is faint-hearted. It lacks imagination. They don't live up on that side of the House to the rhetoric they use on the campaign trail that they stand up for victims. This legislation does nothing for most victims. It's weak. It does not do what the government could have done if there'd been a proper review, if they'd worked through the options, if they'd got their officials working hard in the 4 years that they've had in government to actually put something in place that would see a far wider extension of looking after the victims, ensuring restorative justice, ensuring that people who rip off others are required to put things right when they're in the position to do so. On all of those measures, this legislation fails, and that is why every member of the government has got their head down at the moment, because they know the truth of what I am saying. This is weak legislation. It could have been much better.
I call the honourable member David Clendon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it's a little bit like Groundhog Day. Very strong sense of deja vu, yet again standing to speak